Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's town hall. We'll be beginning today's town hall in just a moment. I'll be posting links and other information in the chat, so try to pay attention to that if you can. We'll have a lot of good information in there for you. And again, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to hit us up in the chat with those questions. I'm going to provide a link right to our assessment and taxation department right now if everybody would like that. There you go. Okay, well, let's start today's town hall. I want to welcome everyone to tonight's Clackamas County Assessment and Taxation Department Town Hall. I'm Scott Anderson with the Clackamas County Public and Government Affairs Department. Joining us today are Clackamas County Assessor Tammy Little, along with her staff. And just so you know that combined, they have been working in the assessment and taxation field for more than 100 years. They're incredibly knowledgeable about the property tax system. The purpose of today's town hall is for residents to gain a better understanding of property taxes and have confidence in the tax system, and for our experts to answer any questions you may have about property taxes or the tax process. If you have a question during the presentation, please don't hesitate to ask it. You can simply utilize the raise hand button on the Zoom bar that's at the top or the bottom of your device. If you're joining us on the phone, you can hit *9 to indicate you have a question. You can also ask questions via the chat function, which I just mentioned. Simply type your question in there and I'll go ahead and read it. I want you to know that our staff is very happy to answer any and all questions as we go along. Part of today's town hall is to get answers to your specific property tax questions. When you registered for today's event, you marked down if you needed to talk with an assessment and taxation staff member. If you said you do need to talk to one of our appraisers, we'll be reaching out to you after the presentation. If after the presentation you found that you do now need to ask a specific question regarding your property taxes, we can connect you with an appraiser. You can do that by calling our main office line at 503-655-8671. Again, that number is 503-655-8671, or by sending an email to propertytaxinfo@clackamas.us. Again, that's propertytaxinfo@clackamas.us. And I'll be mentioning this information again after the presentation today. Speaking of today's presentation, please be aware that this session is being recorded and will be available to watch by tomorrow morning on the county's YouTube channel. And with that, we're going to go to Clackamas County Assessor Tammy Little for opening comments. Tammy?
Thanks, Scott. Good evening, everyone. I'm Tammy Little, Clackamas County Assessor, and I'd like to welcome you to our second virtual town hall. This is the first year we've done them, and thank you for attending. Every fall for the past 3 decades, your assessor's office has hosted 8 to 10 community town halls around Clackamas County to help taxpayers understand Oregon's complex property tax system and to individually answer taxpayer questions. While we missed the opportunity to meet with you in person this year, we're happy to still be able to present information and have our staff standing by to answer your questions. I want to thank our Public and Government Affairs staff for making this webinar possible and facilitating it. And it's also my privilege to introduce some of our great staff joining us today, including our Appraisal Manager, Lynn Longfellow, Sales Data Analysts, Brandy Peters and Matt Healy, plus our resident Farm and Forest Land Expert, Tony Hunter. In addition, we have several team experts ready to respond to your questions. It's also my pleasure to introduce the Clackamas County Deputy Assessor, Bronson Rueda, who will be giving us the presentation tonight. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Tammy. So as Tammy mentioned, we'll have a presentation from Bronson. Take it away, Bronson.
Okay, thank you. Let me hook up the screen sharing. All right, can everybody see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, good to go. All right, thank you, Tammy, and welcome everyone to the virtual Assessors Town Hall. I'm happy to be part of this event. My name is Bronson Rueda. I am the Deputy Assessor and have been with the Assessment and Taxation Department for nearly 2 years. Prior to my time at Clackamas County, I spent 8 years at the Oregon Department of Revenue in the Property Tax Division, where I held various positions. The last one was the Valuation Section Manager. In that role, I managed about 35 appraisers and 3 subordinate managers. Prior to my time at the Oregon Department of Revenue, I spent 9 years as a commercial fee appraiser. The last 5 of those, I managed a team of appraisers that focused on office and medical office valuations in Oregon, mostly for financing purposes. Now, about today's presentation, as Tammy stated previously, one of the goals is to help residents gain a better understanding of our property tax system. I will also give a broad overview of our real estate market and property taxes. Again, if you have any questions throughout this presentation, please ask at any time by raising your virtual hand or using the chat function. We will also have time at the end for questions. For the next slide, I want everyone to remember back in school when the teacher would cue up a movie for the class to watch. Well, some kids love watching videos during class and some did not. Hopefully you folks loved watching videos in class, because this next slide features a short video, 4 to 5 minutes, giving an overview of Oregon's property tax system. So sit back and relax and let's give this video a view. We had some technical difficulties in the first session, so let's hope this one works. Here we go.
This is Joe Meek, one of the most famous men in Oregon history. Fur trapper, mountain man, and the first marshal of the Oregon Territory. Joe was fearless. But Joe had an image problem. You see, Joseph Lafayette Meek was also Oregon's first tax collector. Ooh. In 1843, voluntary contributions were solicited to pay Oregon's provisional legislators. The first-year returns totaled $81.50. Clearly, an assessment was due and enforcement needed. So the legislators decided to tax virtually everything: a person's pocket watch, their horse, saddle, clothing, even tools of their trade. The next year, 1844, the state assessment roll totaled $218,000, with cattle constituting almost half the roll. And that's the way property taxes started in Oregon. People paid property taxes as a percentage of the market value of their property. It was called a levy system, and it stayed that way for over a century. Now it took a while for Oregonians to begin to appreciate what tax dollars do for quality of life. They provide for schools, law enforcement, and fire protection. Citizens were safer, happier, and more comfortable. Life was good. Then, as it always seems to happen, taxes increased. Part of it was because property values kept rising, but part of it also was that there were virtually no limits on the amount of property taxes that districts could levy. Finally, in 1990, Oregon voters approved Measure 5. Measure 5 placed limits on 2 broad categories of property taxes: taxes for public schools and taxes used to support other government operations like fire and police protection. Starting in 1990, real estate values really began to climb, negating some of the good that Measure 5 had done. Still searching for relief from rising taxes, in 1996, Oregonians approved Measure 47, which was designed to limit how fast and how much property values could increase. However, the legislature soon found that measure unworkable. It was scrapped and quickly replaced by Measure 50, which was approved by voters in May of 1997. Measure 50 significantly changed the property tax system. It separated assessed value from real market value, creating a more stable and predictable tax bill from year to year. Under the previous levy-based system, taxing districts receive the full amount of property tax authorized by the voters, regardless of changes in the total assessed value within the district. Annual changes in value had a direct effect on property owners because the rate was just recalculated to raise the amounts requested by the district, and that made tax bills yo-yo and unsettled the voters. Think of it as a cherry pie. Property owners authorize the districts to tax them at a rate that generates enough money to buy a cherry pie. Each year, the district adjusts their rates so that they can buy the entire cherry pie. As the amount of taxable property and its value fluctuates, what they charge each taxpayer changes in order to still be able to buy the whole pie. And when the cost of the pie goes up, so does each taxpayer's property tax bill. Under the new rate-based system, changes in the total assessed value of a taxing district do not change the tax rate. Measure 50 created a maximum assessed value, which was the real market value of your property in 1995 less 10%. Taxes were calculated on the assessed value, which is the lower of the real market value and the maximum assessed value. Since then, growth in the maximum assessed value is limited to 3% regardless of fluctuations in the real estate market, provided there have been no changes to the property, such as new construction. For homes built after 1995, the maximum assessed value is determined using the ratio of maximum assessed value to real market value of similar properties in the county in the year constructed or improved. Long story short, at the time, voters wanted tax limitations and predictability. And while it's not a perfect solution, it is an improvement. If you have questions about any of the content of this video, please reach out to your local assessment and taxation office, and they'll fill you in.
Okay, let me get back to my screen. All right, so if you like that video, there are 4 more Oregon property tax tutorial videos on YouTube for you to watch at your leisure. I think they're interesting and informative, and I recommend giving them a watch. Now, before we get into the meat of this next slide, there are 2 important snippets to remember. Number 1, the assessment date for the values and property tax on your current tax statement is January 1st, 2020. What that means is the market information used to value your property on your current tax statement is from 2019. This is important to remember as we move forward. Number 2, there will be numerous slides in this presentation that have a lot of data. In most of the slides with data, I will point out highlights of the data, and I won't cover the entirety of the slide. So please ask questions if there is something I don't cover that you are curious to learn more about. Now onto the slide. In 2019, we did have real estate value growth, but not at the rate in previous years. Later in this presentation, you will see data that displays this. Now the paragraph on the right of the slide, I'm using my cursor to point things out. Hopefully you can see that. On the right of the slide shows a few stats of the growth we had in Clackamas County. 35 new subdivisions, 1,300 new homes built, and $1.4 billion in additional real market value. Okay, here are some 2019 statistics from RMLS. And RMLS stands for Realtor Multiple Listing Service. It's a website realtors use to list properties and get market data. So this is of the Portland metro area housing market. The next slide, we'll drill down to Clackamas County stats, but here we'll focus on the Portland metro area at a high level. You can see sales of residential properties continue to be strong and sale prices continue to rise. The average sale price went up 1.5%, and the median sale price was up 2.5%. All the indicators on this page point to a good real estate market. Okay, as promised, here is some RMLS data showing the change in market values from 1/1/19 to 1/1/2020 for select Clackamas County neighborhoods. Note that the value changes show how diverse our county is from urban to rural and the difference in market change in those real estate sectors. All right, Scott, I just want to mention if anyone out there needs me to slow down or speed up, you can go ahead and request that.
Okay,
That'll
we've
do.
got nothing in the chat so far, so we'll keep on going.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, in this slide, we're looking at changes in value according to our internal sales study to reach market value as of 1/1/2020 for Clackamas County. What that means is our appraisers here at Clackamas County go out and study the market, achieve market information, and come up with these market adjustments. Here are all of the 16 cities in our county, plus the unincorporated Damascus area. Note the 14% increase in Johnson City. Right here, I'm using my cursor, 14% increase. This is a small city in the county that is entirely made up of a manufactured home park, and that property type went up more than single family residences in 2019 due to their affordability. All right, I really like this slide. This slide is a timeline of some of the events for the Assessment and Taxation Department. It represents both a calendar year and how we operate on a fiscal year. Note that January 1st, over here, January 1st of any given year is our assessment date, and we don't mail tax statements until October, all the way into October. And then the first property tax payment is due by November 15th, which is nearly a year after the assessment date. So let's take a step back and examine the assessment date, and let's talk about the time period to collect market data for the assessment date. It's important to make the connection that the market period of your recent tax statement is from 2019. So let's start from now and work backwards. We're in November. Your property taxes are typically due November 15th, but this year that date falls on a Sunday, so the due date is November 16th, which is next Monday. The taxes that you owe are calculated based on the assessed value of your property as of the assessment date, and remember that date is all the way back in January 1st of 2020. In other words, the values you are looking at on your tax statement represent a point of time 10.5 months ago. Now going further back from 1/1/20, the values on your tax statement are ultimately determined by the market period from 1/1/2019 to 12/31/2019. That time frame is over a year ago. So this is a lot to absorb and can get confusing. So ask questions if you have any. I'm going to move on. All right. The next grouping of slides covers property tax law, specifically Measure 5 and Measure 50. We will cover these two measures in detail in later slides, but at a high level, our property tax system is shaped by these two initiatives put on the ballots by voters that are now part of our Oregon Constitution. I typically don't read slides, but I think this slide is an exception. So I'm going to read the Measure 5 and Measure 50 verbiage here. Measure 5, passed in 1990, is a tax limitation and sets limits on the amount of taxes that can be collected from each property in both the education and general government categories. Measure 50, passed in 1997, is a value limitation and limits maximum assessed value, or MAV, growth to 3% annually. Taxes are based on the lower of real market value or maximum assessed value. In addition, permanent tax rates were established for all local districts with existing tax bases and serial levies. So the big takeaway here is that Measure 5 is a tax limitation and Measure 50 is a value limitation. Neither one of these measures places a 3% cap on your tax growth per year. And we will dig deeper into this later. All right, so what are your taxes based on? Well, it's important to understand two items, which are covered in the first two bullets of this slide. Number one, property in Oregon is not taxed on real market value, or RMV. Number two, property taxes in Oregon are based on a calculated Measure 50 assessed value. Now, for those familiar with California's Proposition 13, established in the late 70s, in Oregon, market value does not reset when the property is sold like it does in California. Finally, taxes in Oregon are calculated on the assessed value, which is the lesser of real market value or maximum assessed value. There's a lot to keep track of, but here's the bottom line again. Typically, the maximum assessed value, or MAV, is equal to the assessed value, or AV, which is what taxes are based on. So if MAV can only go up 3% per year, with some exceptions, this creates the predictability of property taxes, which is what Oregon voters were looking for. One more thing to think about. If you're saying to yourself, well, if MAV can only go up 3%, why do my property taxes sometimes go up more than 3% in a year? One answer is new construction or remodeling a property. Another common answer is that voters in any given district can vote in local option measures or bonds that can increase a property tax bill more than 3%. And this is information that I will repeat and review as we move through these slides because it's important to understand this. Okay, now let's focus on Measure 50. Before I get into what Measure 50 is, I think it's important to understand why we have Measure 50. Prior to Measure 50, taxes were based on the market value of a property. As you know, market values can fluctuate up or down in any given year. Thus, property taxes also fluctuated up and down accordingly, creating a property tax environment that was unpredictable. Well, the voters of Oregon wanted more predictability or consistency in their property taxes, so Measure 50 was born. Okay, so how does Measure 50 work? If you are seeing or hearing this information for the first time, or even the 20th time, this can get very confusing. Due to this, I'm going to more or less read the next couple of slides to try to mitigate any confusion. All right, on this slide, bullet 1, when Measure 50 was passed in 1997, maximum assessed value was created, or MAV. MAV equaled 90% of the 1995-96 real market value. Bullet 2, going forward, Measure 50 limits future growth on MAV to 3% per year, again, with some exceptions. Bullet 3, the exceptions include new construction, remodeling, development of new subdivisions, and rezoning. Bullet 4, Measure 50 established permanent tax rates for all local taxing districts with existing tax basis and serial levies. And then the last bullet, Measure 50 allowed voters to approve new short-term local option levies to fund additional services or approve bond measures for capital improvements. So remember these acronyms. MAV is the maximum assessed value and RMV is the real market value. I'll use those as we go forward. Okay, so you received your property tax bill and maybe your property taxes went up more than 3%. And this slide covers examples of how your taxes may go up more than 3% in any given year. Remember, neither Measure 5 or Measure 50 put a limitation on tax growth, just tax limitations and maximum assessed value growth, respectively. I want to emphasize again the point that taxes can go up more than 3% because we get many phone calls about this topic. This year in particular, some taxes grew more than 3% due to money measures voted in. I also want to note that the Oregon Department of Revenue teaches a 3-day class on this topic, which proves the complexity and many dimensions of Measure 50. So don't be concerned or hesitant to ask questions. Go ahead and bring those questions forth if you have some. All right, we'll move on. Okay, this slide covers the value history of one account in Clackamas County. The time period begins in 1997. I'm using my pointer to highlight the start of Measure 50 in 1997 and ends with this year's value, 2020 to 21. You'll notice there's a break in years from 2000 to 2010, and simply there isn't enough room on this page for all the data. But the data does cover the recession years in the early 2010 time period. And the term, if you look on the upper left, the term "the cut" refers to the 10% off the 1995 value to establish the first 1997 MAV. And the term "cap" refers to the 3% growth cap for MAV, again, with exceptions. And I want to emphasize the 3% maximum growth refers to the growth limit in MAV, not a growth limit in tax increases year over year. So what stands out on this slide to me is the market change, right here, the market change in red, and the AV change, a little lower on the slide, AV change in red. You can see in the market change, the market fluctuates drastically, year over year. You have time periods during the recession where it's a negative change. And then after the recession, in the 2014 time period, you have double-digit growth. So if you were paying taxes on the market value, your property tax bill would fluctuate with the market. And the Oregon voters didn't want that fluctuation. If you look down at the AV change, and again, assessed value is what your taxes are based off of, it's all 3% growth as we move forward. So this one account is a great example of how Measure 50 created the predictability that Oregon voters wanted with their property tax. All right, now I'll get into the changed property ratio. And your acronym for changed property ratio is CPR. So you're asking, well, what is changed property ratio? Remember, Measure 50 was enacted back in 1997, and it created a MAV benefit for all property at that time. The benefit was it took the 1995 values minus 10% to create the MAV in 1997. So all that property received a benefit. But what about property built post 1997? How do they get a MAV and a MAV benefit? Well, for new construction, the assessor's office values the property, which creates the real market value. Then a changed property ratio, or CPR, is applied to the real market value, which creates a MAV for that property, providing a benefit similar to property already in existence. And the CPR is a ratio of MAV to RMV for specific property types and is calculated every year. Let's take a look at the history for CPRs. So here's a list of the CPRs in Clackamas County since 2012. Take a look at the column labeled 6XX forest land. I'm highlighting it with my marker. The CPR for forest land in the 2020-21 tax year is 0.699. This means that any new property built in 2020 will have that ratio applied to the RMV to create a MAV if it's in the forest land area. As you can see, since 2014, the CPR has generally decreased. If you look down at 2012, as I'm going along the forest land CPR 6XX, you can see how the CPR decreases. A decrease in CPR happens when property values are rising. If we hit another recession, the CPR will most likely move upward towards 1. Now let's look at an example. Okay, remember, Measure 50 created a tax benefit for properties in existence in 1997. But for new property, it's fair to give that same benefit. Let's say a property owner builds a new home valued at $502,000. That's the first bullet point, $502,000. That's the RMV, real market value. So we need to give this home the Measure 50 benefit and calculate the math. How we do this is we apply the residential change property ratio of 0.644 to the RMV. After applying the residential CPR, the MAV is created. That's the third bullet point. The MAV is created, which is $323,288. Lastly, taxes are calculated from the assessed value, and the assessed value equals the lesser of RMV or MAV. And when you look at the MAV, it's 502,000, and the MAV is 323,000 and change. So MAV is the lesser, which becomes the assessed value. And this creates a Measure 50 tax benefit similar to other properties already in existence. All right, Scott, is there any questions on the CPO or anything with Measure 50 at this point?
No questions yet.
All right, let's keep rolling. Okay, I have talked about Measure 50, the benefits provided, and the creation of MAV. I gave an example of how new construction creates an exception event, providing a MAV for a property. But there are other exception events besides just building a new house. This slide covers those exception events like remodeling and additions. And you can see on the slide, adding a detached garage or a kitchen remodel. These are all Measure 50 exception events. To tie the concept of Measure 50 back to the misconceived perception that property taxes can only go up 3% a year, nearly every Measure 50 event will increase MAV more than 3% on a property because you're adding more value than was there before. All right, now we get into some visual examples. The next 5 slides, I think, are very interesting. They provide examples of new construction or remodels that trigger Measure 50 exception events. This first example on the left, you have the before and after. Each slide has a before on the left and an after on the right. Here, the house was razed or torn down, and in its place, a new house was built. So this is an obvious example of a Measure 50 exception event because a whole new house was built. All right, second example is again a house, an older house that was torn down and a new house constructed in its place. You can't see it, and this is in the East County of Clackamas. You can't see it, but this was a larger lot, and it was actually divided into more than one lot with more than one house built. So another example of a Measure 50 exception event. Now we'll get into 3 remodel examples. So this is a kitchen remodel example. As you can see on the right, the finishes differ drastically. You have new flooring, a new kitchen island, you have new cabinetry all around, and this created a Measure 50 exception event, which added value to the MAV. Here's another example of a kitchen remodel. Same thing here. We have a new island, new countertops, new cabinetry. You have, look at the ceiling. The before ceiling with the lighting is drastically different than the after. You have recessed can lighting and lighting pendants over the island. And what I think is interesting about this example is if you notice the before, there's a window over here on the left, and then the after, the window's gone. And I think that's interesting because in my experience, you don't typically take out windows, but in this case, there could have been additional windows to the left that aren't shown that added more light to the kitchen. And so perhaps this window wasn't needed and more cabinetry was needed versus that window. So this kind of stuff, again, to me is very interesting, the way that homes are remodeled and different finishes that property owners put in there. All right, this is the last example. And before I talk about it, I want to note, follow my cursor, my arrow. It's kind of hard to tell, but this is the line of the picture split. Everything to the left of the arrow is the before, everything to the right is the after. So you can see the before, the sink and counter was relocated to the rear of the bathroom, and another sink was actually added. And then the shower was taken out and a new tile shower was put in its place. So this was a big remodel of a bathroom. And this also triggered a Measure 50 exception event. All right. So this next slide, this is a snapshot of our website. And this is something that everyone can go to and put in their own address or account number or your neighbors. And you can see how real market value and MAV have grown or decreased over the last 5 years. So the red line is your real market value and the blue line is the MAV. Remember, you are taxed on your assessed value, which is the lesser of RMV and MAV. So in this example, the AV has always been the MAV. The MAV is the blue line because it's always been lower than the RMV. You know, I think this slide makes the point that market adjustments can be more extreme where the AV grows at a constant 3% pace. So you see above, the RMV rises more drastically than the MAV. And the 3% increase for the AV down here, again, gives what the Oregon voters wanted, which is more consistency in the rise in property taxes year over year. One interesting fact I wanted to throw in there is that back in 2012, we had about 30,000 properties where the red line dipped below the blue line, and that was due to the recession. And at that time, we had about 160,000 accounts. All right, now let's get into Measure 5. So we're leaving our discussion about Measure 50, and we're entering our discussion on the other initiative, Measure 5. So Measure 5 limits the amount of taxes that any one taxpayer can pay. The limits are based on RMV, real market value, and fall into two categories: education and general government. The limitation on education is $5 for every $1,000 of real market value. And the limitation on general government is $10 for every $1,000 of real market value. It is important to note that the tax limitations are applied to real market value, but the actual tax is calculated from the assessed value. If the actual tax due goes above the Measure 5 limitations for either category, compression is created. So let's look at the next slide as an example. Okay, so I'm going to use my cursor, so follow along if you want. At the top, there are two values I will be referring to: the real market value, which is $597,000 and change, and the assessed value, which is $466,000 and change. Below the values are 4 column headers: Measure 5 limit, tax calculation, tax imposed, and tax compression due to Measure 5. The next row is education. I'm circling it with my cursor. This has a limitation of $5 in tax to every $1,000 of real market value. We have done the math here for you, but I'll walk you through the numbers. The Measure 5 limit on education is $2,987.40. This is calculated by dividing 5 by 1,000 and then multiplying the result into the real market. Sorry about that. Multiplying the result into the real market value, $597,000. The next column is tax calculation. The education tax rate is given near the bottom of the slide down here under actual tax rates. You can see the education tax rate is 7.2894. This number is per 1,000 of assessed value. And again, assessed value is near the top, 466,000 and change. The resulting tax owed, shown in the education tax calculation column, is $3,399.74. You can see the resulting tax calculation is more than the Measure 5 limitation allows. So the lower number is the tax imposed. Working my cursor over here. This is represented in this column and is $2,987.40. The tax limitation creates compression for this taxpayer in the amount of $412.33. And that's in red right here. This is the compression amount. The taxpayer is saving money by paying less taxes, but on the flip side, the school district, the local school district, is receiving less money into their coffers. It's kind of a double-edged sword. The next row is for general government. Using the same methodology as the education row, you can see the Measure 5 limit is $5,974.79. This is much higher than the tax calculation of $2,797.10. So the actual tax calculation becomes the tax imposed. Therefore, there is no compression for the general government category. The next row is for bonds. Bonds are voted on by the people and are subject, they are not subject to Measure 5 limitations. Now, if you're exposed to this for the first time, it's a lot to take in. Scott, do we have any questions out there?
No, no questions.
Okay, good. Let's move on. So what has happened this fall? Okay, we've talked about how our tax system works and the market conditions for Clackamas County. Now let's focus on some of the results for the current 2021 tax roll. There was a 5% growth in real market values for the county as of the assessment date of 1/1/20, and most properties' assessed value grew by 3%. If you're one of those taxpayers who had a tax increase of greater than 3%, it may be due to a new money measure passing or a district levied more for bonded debt. Likewise, if you had a tax increase of less than 3% or even a negative amount, it could be due to taxing districts levied less or paid off some of that bonded debt. Now let's look at the taxing districts that had the greatest amount of tax rate change, either up or down. All right, if you read this year's property tax press release, this slide will look familiar. These are the changes in voter approved money measures that passed for the 2021 tax year. And take a look at this slide and you can see if any of these taxing districts are in your tax code area on your property tax statement. It may be an indicator of why your property taxes decreased or increased less or more than you anticipated. Notice there are no new local options that raised more money, just renewals at the same rate. Taxing, if you look at the right here, taxing districts that show an increase, like Canby School, I live in the Canby area, so this was on my tax statement. Taxing districts that show an increase are areas that had new bonds passed on top of existing bonds, which raised the tax amount. Where there are negative changes, like Centennial School and Estacada School, those districts levied a little less for their bonds. Now, if you have specific questions on what each taxing district uses their money for, you will need to contact that taxing district and ask those questions. All right, the previous slide outlined the money measure changes in the county. This slide outlines the result of what your property taxes actually did, either go up or down. So take a look at this and see where your property lands. Again, I live in the Canby area, so I'm circling the Canby area. You can see 4% and 5% in Canby rural. You know, that's the highest out of all of these changes. So I don't know, if I don't win a prize, I just get to pay more taxes. But remember, factors that control how much your taxes change from last year include voter improved money measures and new bonds, Measure 50 exception value, compression, and taxing districts levying lower or higher rates. All right, you have seen this taxing matrix similar to this a few slides back. In the previous matrix, the calculation showed compression. In this matrix, it shows how the education and general government categories did not change, but still the tax change from last year to this year was 5.41%, which is greater than 3%. Follow my cursor. If you look down at the bottom, the education and general government, the rate did not change. You can see here in this column, rate change 0 and 0. But if you look down at the bonded debt, that actual tax rate went up 33 cents per thousand of real market value. So the reason for the increase of this account for over 3% is due to the rate change in the bonded debt. All right, now we're getting into the data, lots of slides with data. I think there's 5 of them. So if you have any questions about the data that I don't cover, please jump in there and ask. This is a slide that shows a lot of data that I think is interesting. If you focus on the 2020 column right here and work your way down, you can see the value and tax numbers that Clackamas County has and the changes in the past couple of years, 2020, 19, and 18. This year, the county's RMV, real market value, is over $86 billion. The taxable value is over $55 billion, and the taxes imposed are over $962 million. Now that is a lot of property taxes to collect for our staff. Another item of note is the accounts in compression row. I'm circling it right now, accounts in compression. You can see the last 2 years, the number of accounts in compression was relatively stagnant. But from 2018 to 2019, there was a big jump. This is unusual because typically in appreciating real estate markets, there is a decrease in the amount of compression. What happened here is a taxing district approved a local option money measure. It was voted, a local option money measure that created more compression for many accounts. All right, let's move on and look at some more statistics. Okay, last week when I was going over these slides with Tammy Little, the assessor, she told me that this was her favorite slide. So I feel a little bit of pressure to deliver here. This slide goes back 22 years and shows the change in market value and assessed value of all of the accounts in Clackamas County. This time period is post Measure 50. Remember, Measure 50 was enacted in 1997. And you can see the ups and downs of the market value, including the recession years, 2009 and 2009 through 2012. So here's the column for market value. Here's the column for assessed value. You can see the growth rate, the percentage increase and decrease fluctuated greatly year over year. However, the growth rate in the assessed value did not have such the drastic increases or decreases. And this is the result that the taxpayers, the voters were looking for. They wanted more consistency in what they paid year over year for property taxes. All right, the last slide showed how values fluctuated and grew over time. This slide focuses on the change in tax imposed since 1997. Items of note on this slide include, number one, the amount of taxes imposed in 1997, follow my cursor, dropped 2.5%. That was the first year Measure 50 was instituted. Next, in the 2010-2012 timeframe, right up here, the growth rate in taxes dropped significantly, below 3%. This was due to the recession. But I will note taxes still grew over these years. They never dipped into the negative. This is due to Measure 50. In 2019, up here, look at this 8.05%. It's kind of stands out between the other percents as in terms of growth. That higher percentage is due to money measures voted in, new construction, and the normal 3% growth. All right, let's move on to the next slide. All right, now this is an interesting slide. Look at the column headers. Let's orientate ourselves before we dig into the data. You have the years over here on the left, and then in white here is the total Measure 5 compression loss that we had in the county. And on the left, it breaks it down between the education loss and the general government loss. And over here are the number of accounts. So remember, compression loss typically increases when market values are going down and coming closer in line with MAV. And then compression loss typically decreases as real estate appreciates, and there's a greater separation between real market value and MAV. Look at the chart to see how this is shown to be true from the historic numbers. From 2011 through 2013, right here, when market values were generally declining due to the recession, compression was increasing. See here, the compression increasing. Then in 2014, when the real estate market was rebounding, compression loss started to decline. Here's the decline of the compression loss. The anomaly here is in 2019. And if you've noticed, I have repeatedly brought up 2019 as an anomaly because of certain money measures that were voted in. But in 2019, when real estate market values were continuing to increase, but the compression loss also increased. This was due again to money measures voted in that increased the tax rate significantly for certain taxing districts that created compression. Now you're probably wondering, okay, my tax dollars, where do they go? Where do my property tax dollars go? So take a look at this graphic. It displays how much out of each dollar collected in property taxes goes to the local services in the county. Starting on the upper left is the schools K through 12. They receive 42.99 cents of every tax dollar collected. Next is the county, which receives 17.79 cents per every property tax dollar collected. And then towards the lower right, the lowest category is miscellaneous, which receives 1.9 cents of every tax dollar collected. And miscellaneous includes things like lighting, roads, vector, and water. So turning back to the county, 17.79 cents collected. The next slide depicts how that's broken down into the county's programs. So you can see in the upper right, public safety gets 69% of the county property tax dollars. General government, 9%. Our department down here on the lower right, assessment and taxation, we get 4.9%. And I will note over here on the right is a list of all the programs that are included in the general government category. All right. Again, if I'm moving too fast on some of these graphics, you want to review one a little bit more, just let me know. So let's move on to a sample property tax statement. All right, I want to focus on the right columns over here underneath the 2021 current tax by district header. All right, this is a detailed list by taxing district of the property taxes owed. The first three lines comprise the education category. The next grouping of taxing districts is the general government category. Remember, these two categories are subject to Measure 5 tax limitations and can be compressed. The last group has 5 line items, and notice at the end of those line items, it says excluded from limit, right down here where my cursor is. These line items are bonds voted in that are not subject to Measure 5 tax limitations. So as you look at your property tax statement, if you have any questions on it, feel free to call our office during our open to the public hours. Our phone lines are open from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. and are ready to answer your questions.
Bronson, speaking of questions, we have one.
All right.
We have an attendee who says, I'm looking to purchase a new home in Clackamas County. To determine the MAV, would I take the purchase price and times it by 0.64?
Okay, so that's a good question. If I understand it correctly, there is someone in the audience that is looking to purchase a home in Clackamas County, and it's an existing home in Clackamas County. So since it's an existing home, the MAV has already been set, and no matter what you buy the property for, it's not going to change the MAV. The MAV has been set and will remain there over time until an exception event occurs. And an exception event, remember, is like a remodel for a property, or if it's torn down and rebuilt. So your purchase will not affect the maximum assessed value.
Okay, thank you.
Hey Bronson, let me jump in here. If I
Sure.
understood the question, I'm looking at the chat. It indicates it's a new home,
Oh,
not
okay.
an existing home. And so typically that's a really good indicator. What you would also want to know is whether or not when the subdivision was created, where the new home is located. So if it was an existing subdivision, the MAV, that maximum assessed value of the land, might have been established a few years ago. But overall, that's a pretty good indicator, but could have some variables. So please reach out to us. We're happy to provide an estimate of what that might be.
Yep, thanks, Len. I had misunderstood the question. I thought it was a property that had been there for a while, but that's a good point. Thank you. And yeah, Len is right. If you do have questions on that specific property, give us a call. Give us the account number, give us the address, and we can talk to you about that specific property. Okay, the next 4 slides deal with appeals and the appeal process. So it's important to note that when you appeal, you are appealing your value. You are not appealing the amount of taxes that you owe. Remember, for most taxpayers, the real market value is higher than the assessed value. So if your appeal results in a value reduction, there still may not be any tax reduction if the real market value does not go below the assessed value or result in Measure 5 compression. So referring to the last bullet on the slide, if you have new construction or another Measure 50 exception event and you think your value is too high, then you need to appeal, because the first year after an exception event is what sets your MAV. Once your MAV is established, then that is where it stays, except the 3% increase, the typical 3% increase every year. So what's the process of appealing? So this slide, I think all this information is very important if you want to appeal. So I'm gonna walk through each bullet on this slide and the next one as well. So bullet 1, call our office and talk to an appraiser, and we can check to ensure our records are accurate and let you know if you may receive a tax decrease based on your requested value. Bullet 2, appeals are processed through the County Board of Property Tax Appeals, and that's referred to BOPTA. That's the acronym for Board of Property Tax Appeals. And this is the first official step. Bullet 3, BOPTA is administered by the county clerk's office, not by our office. That's important to note. The county clerk administers the BOPTA program. Bullet 4, the appeal paperwork must be filed before the end of this year, December 31st, excuse me, I'll say it again, December 31st of 2020. And that date holds true for every year. You have to get your appeal paperwork in by the end of December. Bullet 5, BOPTA hears value appeals, not appeals of the tax you have to pay. Bullet 6, any value shown on your tax statement can be appealed. And the last bullet, the board starts to consider appeals on the first Monday in February, and the process ends by April 15th, sometimes earlier. So I want to go over some keys to the appeal process. Bullets 1 and 2, remember the assessment date is always January 1st for every tax assessment year. This is the date we determine value. For your current property tax, the assessment date is January 1st of 2020. Bullets 3 and 4, the appellant has the burden of proof. This means the petitioner will need to have market evidence that shows support for the claim that the assessor's value is incorrect. Bullet 5 mentions preponderance of evidence. What does preponderance of evidence mean? Well, the appellant must persuade that it is more likely than not that the facts presented are true. Bullet 6 and 7. These bullets cover a couple of common mistakes. 1, comparing your property tax to your neighbor's property tax. Remember, you are appealing value, not taxes. Another common mistake is comparing your values to the values of your neighbors. You need to compare your value to comparables, and we'll get into that in the supporting documentation, which is the next slide. So supporting documentation, this is the information that you should have to appeal successfully. So bullet 1, a recent sale of the property. So if you're appealing your own property, if you just purchased it and you think based off of your purchase price that the assessor has a value too high, bring that information to us. So for instance, if you purchase your home in an arm's length transaction, and arm's length simply means that it was listed by a realtor, it was open on the market for an appropriate amount of time. So all parties that are looking for similar houses had a chance to look at that property and decide whether or not they wanted to buy it. If it's a arm's length transaction, and say you paid $350,000 for it, and we have it valued at $450,000, that could be an indicator that we have your property value too high. Bullets 2 and 3. If you have a recent fee appraisal, that will have a lot of good information. That appraisal will have a list of 4 or more comparable sales that support a value, which is what bullet 3 is describing. A comparison of sold properties similar to yours. Bullet 4, it's good if you have some sort of proof that we have an error in our records. Well, that's not good. It's not good that we have an error, but if you have some sort of proof that we have an error in our records, bring that to us. For example, if we have your home listed as 2,200 square feet in our records, and your home is actually only 1,800 square feet, bring that to us so we can make the correction. Bullet 5, construction costs. Construction costs can be an indicator of value, especially for new construction. And then the last bullet, income and expense information for income producing properties like office buildings, retail centers, and multifamily housing. So I mentioned before at the beginning, I used to be a commercial appraiser, and this is the kind of information that I analyzed. The income and expense information of an income producing property can oftentimes be a good indicator, the best indicator of value for that property.
Bronson, we have another quick question.
All right.
Somebody is asking to reiterate the valuation date as of 1/1/2020.
Right.
And
They're asking. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's all the attendee said.
Okay, so the assessment date is January 1st of any given tax year. So if you're looking at your property tax bill and you're looking at your values, those values are as of 1/1/2020 of this year. That's the assessment date.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay. So let's move on. We just have 2 more slides, and I'm going to move somewhat quickly through these. Well, here I want to point out contact information. If you have questions on these 2 programs, farmland or forest land deferrals, contact Tony Hunter. He is our resident expert and can answer any question. Down at the bottom of the slide is a snapshot from our website, where you can also go to obtain more information, including eligibility requirements on these 2 deferral programs. Okay, last slide. This includes the contact information for Susan Brookshire. She is our expert on the Senior and Disabled Deferral Program and for veterans and active duty military exemption programs. And speaking of veterans, tomorrow is Veterans Day. I'm a veteran and served 4 years in the Army. And I want to say thank you to all the veterans and current military personnel out there for your service. I appreciate what you have done and what you are currently doing for our country. So, depending on your perspective, you may be happy or sad to know that that is the end of the presentation. And do we have any further questions?
Great. Thank you, Bronson. As Bronson mentioned, we'll be taking more questions now. Again, for those who wish to ask a question right now, you can utilize the raise hand button on the Zoom bar. That's at the top or bottom, depending on your device. Or if you're joining us via phone, you can hit *9 to indicate that you have a question. I also want to repeat that if you found that you want to talk to one of our appraisers after tonight's town hall regarding a specific property tax question, you can always call our main office line at 503-655-8671. The number again is 503-655-8671, or send an email to propertytaxinfo@clackamas.us. I put all that information in the chat. Does anyone have any questions? We didn't have too many questions during the presentation, and it doesn't seem like anybody's raising their hand. So I think with that, I will wrap up tonight's town hall. I want to thank all of our guests here today and everyone who joined us online. Again, if you have any questions or would like to speak to an appraiser, be sure to call us, the Assessment and Taxation Department, at 503-655-8671, or send an email to propertytaxinfo@clackamas.us. You can also find us online at clackamas.us/AT. Again, thank you to all the panelists and attendees for attending tonight's town hall. Thank you very much and have a great night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.